Then taste it, my daughter-in-law said softly at my son's wedding, smiling as if she had just told a charming joke. And in that quiet second, I realized the entire room had just learned exactly where I stood in my own family. The ballroom at the Lakeshore Grand was beautiful that evening, the kind of place with high ceilings, warm golden lights, and long white tables dressed in linen so smooth it looked like fresh snow. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandeliers, and a string quartet played something gentle near the windows that overlooked Lake Michigan. My son Daniel had always loved water views, even when he was little, so when the venue manager opened those tall windows earlier that afternoon and the breeze drifted in from the lake, I had smiled and thought how proud his father would have been if he were still alive to see this day. I remember standing near the reception table with a small porcelain gift I had carried carefully in my purse, a delicate little clock Daniel's father had bought in Vermont 30 years earlier. I had planned to give it to Daniel and his new wife Brianna after the speeches, something simple, something meaningful, a reminder that time inside a family should be treated gently. But as the catering staff rolled out the buffet, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, just the kind of quiet pause that spreads across a room when people sense tension but don't yet understand it. Brianna was standing beside one of the serving tables where large silver dishes held roasted chicken, vegetables, and a bowl of mashed potatoes still steaming under soft lights. She looked radiant in her white dress, every curl of her blonde hair perfectly arranged, every movement deliberate. When she turned toward me, her smile was polished, the same smile she had worn all afternoon for photographers and guests. For a moment I assumed she wanted a photo with me, something families often do at weddings. Instead, she gestured lightly toward the buffet and said in that same pleasant voice, "Mrs. Parker, since you always care so much about how things are done, maybe you should taste it." A few people laughed, uncertain whether it was meant to be playful. Someone near the bar stopped mid-conversation. I felt the warmth from the food table and the soft murmur of guests all around us. But what I noticed most was Daniel standing a few feet away, holding a glass of champagne and looking everywhere except at me. In that moment, I understood something with a clarity that surprised even me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a careless joke. It was a performance. Brianna stepped slightly aside, leaving the serving spoon resting in the bowl as if presenting a stage prop. The mashed potatoes were smooth and pale under the lights, steam rising slowly, the scent of butter and cream drifting through the air. I could hear the quartet playing behind us and the quiet clicking of silverware as someone set down a plate. For a heartbeat, no one moved. I reached for a napkin from the table beside me, folded it once between my fingers, and looked directly at Brianna. Her eyes held mine with a calm confidence that only comes from believing you have already won. Around us, the guests waited, some smiling awkwardly, some pretending to study the menu cards on the tables. I realized then that humiliation doesn't arrive loudly. It enters a room the way a draft slips through a window, silent, cold, undeniable. And the strangest part was that I didn't feel anger first. I felt recognition. Because in that quiet ballroom, surrounded by flowers and candlelight and the polite applause of strangers, I finally understood that the story of this wedding had begun long before that bowl of mashed potatoes ever reached the table. I stood there for a moment with the folded napkin still in my hand, listening to the quiet rustle of guests pretending not to stare. The steam from the serving table drifted upward into the warm ballroom air, and the scent of butter and cream lingered gently around the buffet. Brianna had already turned slightly toward another group of guests, laughing softly as though nothing unusual had happened. The performance was over for her. For me, it had just begun. I dabbed the napkin lightly against my cheek and set it down on the edge of the table. The fabric of my navy blue dress still felt smooth under my fingertips, the same dress I had carefully pressed that morning while sunlight came through the kitchen window of my small house on Maple Street. I had woken early that day, before 7 o'clock, the way I always did. Since Daniel's father passed away 3 years earlier, the house had been quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when a home has lost one of its voices. I had made a cup of coffee, stood by the sink, and watched the early spring light settle over the backyard fence. It was Daniel's wedding day. I remember thinking that sentence more than once while I stirred cream into my coffee. My son was getting married. Mothers are supposed to feel joy on a morning like that, and I did. I also felt something softer and harder to describe. The way a person feels when a chapter of life quietly turns its last page. Daniel had been my whole world for a long time. When he was 8 years old, he used to leave toy boats floating in the bathtub for hours, convinced that one day he would live somewhere near a big lake. When he was 16, he begged me to let him take a summer job at the marina outside town so he could save money for college. And when he finally moved to Chicago after graduation, he called every Sunday afternoon without fail. That was before Brianna entered his life. I do not say that with bitterness. At least I did not at first. When Daniel introduced her to me 4 years ago, she seemed charming, polished, the kind of young woman who knew how to fill a room with conversation. She had a bright smile and quick confidence, and Daniel looked at her the way young men look when they believe they have discovered the future. I welcomed her the best way I knew how. I invited them to dinner every few weeks. I baked the lemon pie Daniel loved when he was growing up. The first Christmas after they began dating, I even gave Brianna my late mother's pearl bracelet, a small family piece that had been passed down through 3 generations of women. I believe gestures like that built bridges between people. But bridges only work if both sides want to meet in the middle. Over time, something subtle began to change. Phone calls from Daniel became shorter. Invitations came later, sometimes after plans had already been decided. When they bought their condominium downtown, Daniel mentioned it casually during a 5-minute conversation instead of asking if I wanted to see it first. I told myself that was simply the rhythm of young couples building their own lives. Parents must learn to step back. That is what everyone says. And I believed it. Standing in that ballroom now, watching Brianna greet guests while Daniel continued avoiding my eyes, those memories unfolded inside my mind like quiet photographs sliding across a table. Each one looked harmless by itself. A missed phone call, a forgotten dinner, a polite smile that did not quite reach the eyes. But when you place enough small moments together, a pattern eventually appears. I looked again at the buffet table, the silver dish of mashed potatoes slowly losing its steam under the lights, and I realized that what had happened a few minutes earlier was not the beginning of the story at all. It was simply the moment when the pattern finally revealed itself to everyone else in the room. I remained beside the buffet table for another minute, not because I needed food, but because leaving too quickly would have made the moment look like defeat. The quartet continued playing near the windows, the music gentle and polite, the kind of melody people forget the moment it ends. Guests slowly returned to their conversations, though I could feel glances drifting toward me every few seconds. Weddings are strange that way. People come expecting happiness, and when something uncomfortable slips into the room, they pretend not to notice, as if silence can smooth it over like a wrinkle in a tablecloth. I picked up a clean plate from the stack, served myself a small portion of vegetables, and walked calmly toward one of the round tables near the edge of the ballroom. My steps were steady. Years of teaching second grade had trained me well in the art of keeping a composed face even when a classroom felt 1 second away from chaos. The chair across from me remained empty as I sat down. For a few moments, I simply listened to the sound of silverware, soft laughter, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Daniel eventually approached the table. I noticed him before he spoke because I recognized the way he cleared his throat when he felt uncomfortable. He had done that since he was 10 years old whenever he had to admit he had broken something in the house. He stood beside the chair but did not sit. His tuxedo fit him well, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be hiding inside the man he had become. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice careful. "Brianna was only joking earlier. The day has been stressful." I looked up at him and studied his face. There was no cruelty there, only a tired kind of avoidance. That was somehow worse. A cruel person at least understands what they are doing. Someone who chooses not to see is harder to reach. "Of course," I replied calmly. "Weddings can be overwhelming." My answer seemed to relieve him. He nodded once and glanced back toward the dance floor where Brianna was greeting another group of guests. "We just want a night to go smoothly," he added. "Everyone is watching." I almost smiled at that. Everyone had already been watching. They had seen far more than Daniel realized. He returned to Brianna a moment later, and I remained at the table finishing the small portion of food on my plate. It tasted ordinary. Potatoes, roasted carrots, green beans with a light glaze. Nothing remarkable. Yet as I sat there, another memory surfaced, one I had not thought about in months. It was from last autumn when Daniel and Brianna invited me to dinner at their condominium downtown. The place was modern, full of tall windows and pale gray furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable. During the meal, Brianna spoke at length about how important appearances were in professional circles, especially in a city like Chicago. She described networking events, charity galas, and the importance of maintaining a certain image. At one point, she glanced toward Daniel and said with a light laugh, "Families can sometimes complicate things if people do not understand boundaries." Daniel had nodded quietly while cutting his steak. I had said nothing at the time because the comment seemed vague enough to ignore. Sitting in the ballroom now, I understood it had not been vague at all. Brianna had been explaining the rules of her world. In that world, people were useful when they enhanced the picture and inconvenient when they did not. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked around the room again. The chandeliers reflected softly in the tall windows. Waiters carried trays of sparkling water and wine from table to table. Guests complimented the decorations and the view of the lake. From the outside, it was a perfect wedding reception. But perfection is often just careful arrangement. And arrangements can be changed. That was the thought that settled quietly into my mind as the music shifted and the first dance began across the floor. The music slowed as Daniel and Brianna stepped onto the dance floor for their first dance, and every guest in the ballroom turned their attention toward them. Soft applause moved through the room like a gentle wave, followed by the quiet opening notes of a familiar love song. The lights dimmed slightly, leaving the center of the room glowing under the warm chandelier above them. From where I sat near the edge of the ballroom, I could see Daniel's hand resting carefully at the small of Brianna's back while she leaned closer, smiling the kind of smile photographers love. Cameras lifted. Phones appeared above tables. The entire room seemed to settle into that moment, the picture of a perfect wedding reception. I watched them move slowly across the polished floor, and for a moment my mind drifted again to another dance many years earlier. It was a small church hall decorated with simple white ribbons and folding chairs, the kind of place that smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. That was the night I married Daniel's father, Thomas Parker. We did not have a quartet or crystal glasses. We had a borrowed sound system and a homemade cake my sister baked the night before. But when Thomas placed his hand in mine during our first dance, he looked at me with the steady warmth of a man who believed family meant standing beside one another even when life became difficult. That belief carried us through 38 years of marriage, through long winters, through tight budgets, through raising a child who grew taller every year in the small house on Maple Street. After Thomas passed away, I kept that belief quietly inside me like a small lantern. I believe Daniel had grown up seeing it too. The applause in the ballroom brought me back to the present as the dance ended. Brianna lifted the edge of her dress slightly, while Daniel spun her once more before the music faded. Guests clapped again, louder this time, and the master of ceremonies stepped forward with a microphone to announce the next part of the evening. Toast would begin shortly. Servers moved through the room collecting empty plates, while others replaced water glasses and refilled wine. The rhythm of the reception continued smoothly, as though the earlier moment near the buffet table had never happened. I folded my hands together on the table and looked toward the large windows again. Beyond the glass, Lake Michigan stretched dark and calm under the night sky. Small lights from distant boats blinked quietly across the water. I had always liked that view. Water has a way of making a person feel both very small and very clear at the same time. As the first speaker approached the microphone, I noticed a young man from the catering staff standing near the service entrance across the room. He had been working at the buffet earlier. His posture was hesitant, as if he had been watching something carefully and had not yet decided whether to speak. For a brief second our eyes met. He looked away quickly and returned to arranging a tray of glasses, but the expression on his face lingered in my thoughts. It was not curiosity. It was the quiet discomfort of someone who had witnessed more than he expected to see during what was supposed to be an ordinary wedding shift. The best man began his toast then, telling stories about Daniel from their college years. Laughter rippled through the ballroom as guests listened and raised their glasses. Brianna leaned her head lightly against Daniel's shoulder while he smiled for the room. I listened politely, nodding once or twice at the familiar stories. But my attention drifted again to the edges of the evening, to the spaces between conversations, to the small details people often overlook when they believe a celebration is unfolding exactly as planned. Because sometimes the most important truths do not stand in the center of the dance floor. They wait quietly near the doors, beside the serving tables, or in the careful silence of someone who saw a moment that was never meant to be explained aloud. The best man finished his toast to another round of applause, and glasses lifted around the ballroom like a small forest of sparkling light. I raised my own glass as well, though I did not drink from it. Across the room, Daniel placed an arm around Brianna's shoulders while guests leaned closer to congratulate them. The master of ceremonies thanked the speaker and announced that dinner service would continue before the next round of speeches. The room relaxed again into conversation, laughter, and the soft rhythm of plates and silverware. I sat quietly at my table, watching the movement of the evening the way a teacher watches a classroom from the back row. When you spend decades observing children, you learn that people reveal more when they think no one is paying attention. A few minutes later, the same young catering assistant I had noticed earlier approached my table, carrying a tray of water glasses. He moved carefully, his posture polite but uncertain, as though he had rehearsed something in his mind and had not yet decided whether to say it aloud. He set a glass beside my plate and gave a brief nod. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "would you like some fresh water?" His voice was respectful, the kind of tone someone uses when speaking to a teacher or a grandmother. I thanked him and noticed that he did not immediately step away. Instead, he glanced once toward the buffet area and then back toward me, lowering his voice slightly so it would not carry beyond the table. "I hope everything earlier did not make your evening difficult," he said carefully. The sentence was worded so gently that it took a moment for its meaning to settle. I looked at him more closely then. He could not have been older than 22, perhaps a college student working evening shifts. His name tag read Michael. "Weddings can be complicated," I replied, offering him the same calm tone I had used all night. Michael hesitated again before speaking. "I was working the buffet when it happened," he said. "Miss Collins spoke with our manager about the serving arrangement earlier this afternoon. She wanted that particular dish placed near the center of the table." He gestured subtly toward the buffet behind him. His words were simple, but they carried the quiet weight of confirmation. I felt no surge of anger when I heard them, only a deeper clarity. Sometimes truth arrives not with drama, but with the soft voice of someone who simply does not like seeing unfairness ignored. "Thank you for telling me," I said after a moment. Michael nodded once more and continued on his way to the next table. I watched him disappear among the guests carrying his tray of glasses. The room looked the same as it had all evening. White linens, soft music, polished smiles. Yet the shape of the night had changed slightly inside my mind. Across the dance floor, Brianna laughed with a group of her friends, while Daniel listened with the patient expression he used whenever he did not wish to interrupt. They looked happy, confident, certain that the celebration was unfolding exactly as they had planned. I lifted my glass and took a small sip of water. The taste was cool and clean. Near the windows, the lake remained calm, its dark surface reflecting scattered lights from the shoreline. I thought again about something Thomas once told me during a quiet evening on our back porch many years ago. "Respect is like glass," he had said while fixing the handle of an old lantern. "Once someone chooses to treat it carelessly, they cannot complain when it breaks." At the time, I had not paid much attention to the remark. Life had been full of ordinary worries then: grocery lists, school meetings, mortgage payments. But sitting in the Lakeshore Grand Ballroom now, listening to laughter echo against the high ceiling, I understood the wisdom of that simple sentence. Because the evening was not truly about a bowl of potatoes or a careless comment. It was about something older and more serious than embarrassment. It was about the quiet moment when a person finally realizes that dignity must sometimes be protected in silence until the right moment arrives to speak. I remained at the table for a long moment after Michael walked away, letting the quiet truth of his words settle into the space inside my thoughts. Around me, the reception continued with the smooth rhythm of a carefully organized evening. Guests laughed, glasses touched in soft toasts. Someone near the dance floor told a story that caused a wave of cheerful applause. On the surface, nothing had changed, yet the atmosphere felt different to me now, as if a thin curtain had been pulled aside to reveal the machinery behind the celebration. Brianna moved gracefully between tables, accepting compliments about the decorations and the lake view with effortless confidence. She thanked people for coming, adjusted the train of her dress, and leaned close when someone offered advice about married life. From a distance, she looked exactly like the bride every wedding magazine promises: elegant, composed, admired. Daniel followed a few steps behind her with the patient expression he had worn all evening, nodding politely as relatives shook his hand. Watching them together, I understood something that had taken me years to recognize. Brianna did not create chaos loudly. She arranged situations carefully, the way someone arranges flowers in a vase until the picture looks perfect from the front. Anyone standing behind the arrangement, however, might notice the stems bending in directions they were never meant to grow. My eyes drifted again toward the buffet table where the silver serving dishes had begun to empty as guests returned for second helpings. Steam no longer rose from the potatoes. The surface had settled into a smooth, pale shape under the warm lights. A simple dish, harmless by itself. Yet earlier that evening it had been placed exactly where Brianna wanted it, just as Michael had explained. The detail might have seemed small to someone else, but details matter when a person spends years observing how intentions unfold in ordinary rooms. I thought again about the dinner at Daniel and Brianna's condominium last autumn. After Brianna spoke about appearances and professional circles, she had shown me the guest list for a charity gala they planned to attend. She described each person with careful precision: who had influence, who owned which company, who could open the right doors in the city. When she reached the end of the list, she had smiled politely and said, "Some relationships are investments, and others are simply sentimental." At the time I believed she was speaking about business. Now I understood she had been explaining her entire philosophy of family. I lifted my glass again and watched the condensation slide slowly down the side. My reflection in the water looked calm, perhaps even thoughtful, but inside me another kind of clarity was forming. Respect cannot be negotiated once someone decides it has no value. It must either be protected quietly or surrendered completely. Across the room, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone and announced that the next round of speeches would begin shortly. Guests gradually found their seats again, pushing chairs across the polished floor while servers refilled glasses with water and wine. The evening moved forward with the predictable order of every wedding reception I had ever attended. Brianna and Daniel returned to the head table, their chairs placed beneath a small arrangement of white roses. Brianna leaned toward him and whispered something that made him laugh softly. For a moment, they looked exactly like a happy couple beginning a new chapter together. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. My decision did not arrive with anger or drama. It arrived the way quiet decisions often do, settling into place like a key turning inside a lock. Tonight did not belong to me. It belonged to the celebration, the photographs, the speeches that would be remembered by the guests who had traveled many miles to attend. But tomorrow would be a different kind of day. Tomorrow would belong to truth, and truth has a way of revealing arrangements that were never meant to last forever. The speeches continued after the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone, and the room settled into attentive silence once more. Daniel's college roommate spoke first, telling a long story about late-night study sessions and how Daniel once drove 3 hours through a snowstorm to help him move apartments. Guests laughed and nodded, the kind of warm reaction people offer when they hear familiar stories about loyalty and friendship. I listened quietly, my hands folded together on the table, watching my son through the soft light that fell across the head table. He looked proud, a little overwhelmed, and perhaps relieved that the evening was moving forward without interruption. Brianna sat beside him, smiling at the right moments, her posture elegant and composed as though every photograph in the room belonged to her. The strange thing about clarity is that once it arrives, it changes the way a person hears ordinary conversations. The speech about loyalty made me think of all the years when Daniel and I had shared small routines that felt permanent at the time. Saturday mornings at the grocery store. Sunday afternoons watching football while the smell of chili filled the kitchen. The quiet pride in his voice when he called to tell me he had been promoted at work. None of those memories disappeared in the ballroom that night. They simply rearranged themselves into something different, like photographs placed in a new frame. When the applause faded, another speaker approached the microphone. This time it was Brianna's older sister, who thanked everyone for traveling to Chicago and described how excited Brianna had been while planning every detail of the wedding. She spoke about the venue, the flowers, the menu, and how carefully Brianna had arranged the seating chart so that every table would feel balanced. Guests nodded with approval, impressed by the organization and elegance of the event. I noticed Brianna glance toward the buffet table briefly when the speaker mentioned the menu. Her expression remained confident, yet the movement caught my attention. For someone who believed she controlled every arrangement in the room, she had looked in that direction more than once that evening. I wondered if she ever considered that arrangements can be remembered just as clearly as they are planned. When the speech ended, music returned to the room and guests began rising from their chairs again. Some moved toward the dance floor, while others walked toward the bar near the entrance. The evening had reached that comfortable stage where people relax, loosen their ties, and allow the celebration to carry them forward. I stood slowly from my seat and walked toward the tall windows facing the lake. The glass reflected the warm light of the chandeliers behind me, while the dark water outside remained calm and steady. From the 22nd floor ballroom, the city looked quiet, its streets glowing softly in the distance. I rested my hand lightly on the window frame and watched a boat move across the lake, its small lights blinking in the darkness. Moments like that have a way of clearing the mind. When you step away from the center of a crowded room, you begin to see the whole picture more clearly. After a few minutes, I returned to my table and collected my purse from the back of the chair. Inside it, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was the small porcelain clock I had brought as a wedding gift. I turned the object gently in my hands, studying the delicate blue patterns along its edge. Thomas had bought it during a road trip through Vermont long ago, saying one day it would mark an important moment in Daniel's life. I placed the clock back inside my purse and closed the clasp quietly. The gift would remain safe for now. Some moments require patience before they reveal where they truly belong. As I lifted my eyes toward the dance floor again, I noticed Brianna watching me from across the room. Her expression held the same calm confidence she had shown all evening, but something in her gaze had changed slightly. Perhaps she sensed that silence does not always mean surrender. Sometimes silence simply means a person has begun to understand the difference between a celebration and a lesson. The music grew livelier as the evening moved forward, and more guests stepped onto the dance floor beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. Laughter echoed through the ballroom as people loosened their jackets and raised their glasses again. Weddings often reach a moment like this when the formal structure fades and the celebration becomes something easier, something people will later remember as joyful and effortless. I returned slowly to my seat and placed my purse carefully beside the chair. From the head table, Daniel and Brianna stood to greet a new group of guests who had arrived late from the airport. Brianna greeted them with the same bright smile she had worn all evening, accepting compliments about the venue, the decorations, and the view of Lake Michigan beyond the tall windows. Daniel listened beside her, nodding politely, occasionally glancing around the room as though checking that everything was unfolding according to plan. I watched them from across the ballroom with the calm attention that comes after a person has already made an important decision. The strange thing about dignity is that it does not require a raised voice. It only requires clarity. I thought again about the small conversation with the catering assistant and about the careful way Brianna had arranged that buffet table earlier in the afternoon. Arrangements reveal intention. They always do. A person who organizes every detail of a wedding down to the placement of a serving dish rarely acts by accident. The evening continued with music and conversation while servers cleared the last of the dinner plates. Eventually, the master of ceremonies announced that dessert and coffee would be served near the bar area for anyone who wished to step away from the dance floor. Guests began drifting toward the long table where slices of cake waited beside small cups and silver spoons. I remained seated for another moment, watching the slow movement of the crowd. The porcelain clock inside my purse felt heavier than it had earlier in the evening, not because its weight had changed, but because its meaning had. I reached into my purse and held the small object. Once more, the delicate blue pattern around its edge reflected the warm light of the chandelier above my table. Thomas had always believed that meaningful gifts should arrive at the right moment rather than the expected one. I remembered him saying that during a quiet Sunday afternoon when Daniel was still in elementary school. At the time, I had thought he was talking about birthdays and Christmas mornings. Now I understood he meant something deeper. Across the ballroom, Brianna noticed me again. Her gaze lingered for a brief second before she turned back toward her guests. Perhaps she assumed I was preparing to leave early, the way embarrassed relatives sometimes do at large gatherings. That assumption did not trouble me. Letting people misunderstand your silence can sometimes be the most useful choice. I stood slowly and walked toward the window once more, pausing beside the tall glass panels that overlooked the dark water of the lake. The city lights reflected across the surface like scattered stars. Behind me, the celebration continued with music and laughter, the sound rising and falling like waves in a distant harbor. For the first time that evening, I felt completely steady. Not angry, not humiliated, simply certain. The next day would not be filled with speeches or dancing. It would be quiet and practical, the kind of day when conversations happen in offices rather than ballrooms. Decisions that had been patiently waiting would finally move forward. I placed the porcelain clock back inside my purse and closed the clasp gently. The gift was still safe, but it would not be given tonight. Some lessons require time before they reveal themselves. And sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is not what happens in the crowded room where it began, but what happens afterward, when the music stops and the truth has space to speak. I left the ballroom shortly after that, not in a hurry and not with the quiet shame that people often expect from someone who has been treated poorly in a public place. I walked past the dance floor where the music had grown louder and guests were laughing with the relaxed energy that comes when a celebration is reaching its final hours. No one stopped me. A few relatives waved politely, assuming I was simply an older guest leaving early, the way many people do after a long evening. The elevator ride down from the 22nd floor was silent except for the soft hum of the cables and the faint echo of music still drifting through the hallway. When the doors opened into the lobby of the Lakeshore Grand, the air felt cooler and calmer, carrying the quiet scent of polished marble and fresh flowers arranged near the reception desk. Outside, the night wind from Lake Michigan moved gently along the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment beneath the tall glass entrance, looking back up at the glowing windows high above where the reception continued. Somewhere up there my son was dancing with his new wife while cameras captured the final photographs of their wedding night. I did not wish them harm. That is important to understand. A mother rarely stops wishing happiness for her child, even when the path between them grows distant. What had changed was something else entirely. I was no longer willing to pretend that respect could be ignored without consequence. The drive home along the lakeshore was quiet. Streetlights passed across the windshield in slow patterns while the dark water of the lake stretched beside the road like an endless sheet of glass. By the time I reached Maple Street, the clock on my dashboard showed a few minutes past 11. My house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, its porch light glowing softly above the steps Thomas built years ago with his own hands. Inside, the living room carried the familiar scent of old books and the lavender candle I had left burning near the window. I placed my purse gently on the kitchen table and removed the porcelain clock from its wrapping. The small hands on its face moved steadily, marking time with quiet patience. For a long moment, I simply watched it, remembering the day Thomas bought it during that trip through Vermont. He had said it would one day mark an important moment in Daniel's life. In a way, he had been right. The next morning sunlight entered the kitchen through the same window where I had stood with my coffee the day before. But this morning felt different. Not heavier, not sad, simply clear. After breakfast, I picked up the phone and called a man named Richard Adler, the attorney who had helped Thomas and me organize our estate several years before his passing. Richard had always been careful and thorough, the kind of professional who believed that written agreements protect relationships as much as they protect finances. When he answered the call, I explained calmly that I wished to review several arrangements that had been made to support Daniel and his future household. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply scheduled a meeting for later that afternoon at his office downtown. When I hung up the phone, I looked again at the porcelain clock resting on the kitchen table. The blue patterns along its edge seemed even brighter in the morning light. Some gifts, I realized, do not belong to the moment people expect. They belong to the moment when truth finally arrives and dignity quietly takes its place beside it.